think it would be criminal to try and compile a list of the greatest directors of cinema history without mentioning Andrei Tarkovsky, especially without even looking at the many fantastic films he's had over his career. One of which we're looking at now being Nostalgia, which is, in my opinion, one of his most underrated films amongst an extremely impressive filmography, despite it being definitely one of the most beautiful films ever made. This film is a kind of museum of just gorgeous photography by cinematography Giuseppe Lanzi, who worked with Tarkovsky once on this one project. And that photography is also guided by, your typical Tarkovsky shots of these very slow, subtle camera movements, i.e., these tracking shots that you see in his films. Many of his feature films would be featured on some lists as, one of the greatest films ever made, whether it be Mirror, this film being Nostalgia, or The Sacrifice, Ivan's Childhood, or so on. These movies would often burn these haunting images into your mind that are just stunning. And I think a part of Tarkovsky's success in his style is that in a lot of his films, especially in Nostalgia, he manages to keep the film's narratives relatively simple. Their forms are, very controlled, and oftentimes you find that the dialogue returns to themes of, art, nationalism, religion, and so on, and spirituality. His films, I think, are very spiritual, not just in their content, but in their form, in their kind of meditative way that that Tarkovsky would frame a scene, how long they'll hold on a shot to sort of penetrate the viewer. And because there's a kind of poetry in his approach to cinema. And obviously, as many people would know, much of that poetry comes from his father. His father himself was a poet, and he even featured some of his father's poems in his movies, like Mirror. When I think of Tarkovsky, I think of cinematic. When we discuss what is cinematic, we're talking about the way in which a director is able to exploit every piece of the medium in order to produce an effect on the audience with the pieces of that medium that are unique to that medium, that you won't find in other mediums of art. So sort of like editing, the cinematography, the camera movement, and so on, that sort of builds a feeling amongst the audience. Tarkovsky believed that every filmmaker, or at least every artist, to sort of develop their own artistic style, that they should sort of become dependent as an artist. This, I think, was true for the most part in his films, except for, especially with his later films, you'd find there are so many strong influences from Swedish director Ingmar Bergman, even so much so to the point where Tarkovsky would shoot many of his films in Bergman-esque areas and use Bergman's actors, especially in a film like, I think, for example, The Sacrifice. I think Tarkovsky's movies require a lot of patience. They're extremely meditative in both style and content. I think how Tarkovsky manages to build that meditative style and that meditative sort of approach is, in one aspect, is his use of atmosphere and the way he uses long takes. For instance, he'll have what you would mean by a long take. He'll have these scenes where it would just be the camera sort of there choreographed in the scene with the actors and with the mise en scène without having to cut. You'd have these long takes that run on for minutes at a time in a Tarkovsky movie. I think the idea is that if you sort of stare at it for so long, at some point you lean closer and closer, sort of giving meaning into it, and then closer and closer, and then you just sort of fall into it, and then the film kind of consumes you. You become I think during this experience, and it is an experience, you become more aware of the passage of time. And in terms of long takes, in contrast to, for example, your contemporary Hollywood films today, is you'd have 2.5 seconds before you get to the next cut in a scene. Whereas in a Tarkovsky film, it's well known that oftentimes you go on minutes before the next cut. And I think the assertion amongst a lot of film theorists is that too much cutting in a scene would cut the viewer's attention, and it stops them from being immersed into the film, and it kind of also works as a way to lead into boredom. The audience might get bored with the film, and they might not even gain or maintain an emotional connection to the film or to what's happening on the screen. And whereas in a Tarkovsky movie, the atmosphere that you get is sort of poignant and so poignant, it feels it's tangible, and he builds that meditative sort of atmosphere by using long takes and even using the way he'll use sound design. And I think the point that I think a lot of people miss initially when experiencing Tarkovsky is a lot of people think that you'd have to have an intellectual approach to it. His movies, I don't think, are meant to be intellectual, and they're not intellectual. They're meant to be emotional. They're not meant to make sense. It's not meant for logic. Tarkovsky himself prioritizes a visceral reaction to what's happening on the screen, as opposed to just appealing to the intellectual. And that's why he rarely uses symbolism. For instance, what does this ocean mean? What does it represent?
I just want to know what he represents.
Well, it's hard to know what it represents, because in a way you're supposed to impose your own meaning into it. You infer your own meaning into it. There's no logic in his movies. There's just instinct. It's appealing to that visceral human instinct, which I think is a very Russian approach to cinema. Take the approach of world cinema that appeals to all people, like that of Fortov. And I think with that, Tarkovsky's films often end up feeling kind of abstract. That abstract is sort of guided through a very strong Tarkovsky-esque aesthetic.
If you indulged in aestheticism for its own sake, it could be called an abstract.
I'm not sure. His films are definitely abstract, but I think are absolutely emotionally involved, as opposed to being cold, when you'd expect that to be cold.
Tarkovsky's films are always long. And one of the things I think he's trying to do is make his films so long that we lose touch with the person that we were when we came into the theater, in a way, that we come entirely into his universe, and he completely absorbs us with these images, including the downtime, including the boring time, so if it is boring, so that by the end he's got us reduced to the point where he can give us the message that he's trying to give us. In other words, it's the opposite of entertaining us. He's trying to absorb it. Certainly can recommend it anyway, especially to anyone who finds that kind of subject matter interesting, because it's not just a propaganda film, it's very thoughtful.